A retired soldier and his loyal dog defied an entire mining town building a shelter underground instead of above it. When the storm of the century arrived, theirs was the only light still burning. What happened next changed how Montana survived its winters. Before we dive in, make sure to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from down below. The wind that slid down from the peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains was thin-sharp and smelled faintly of pine resin and rusting metal. It was late October when Ethan Ward drove his old Ford pickup into Silver Pine Valley for the first time in nearly 20 years. The mountains rose like old ghosts on either side, the same ones he'd stared at through a cracked Humvee windshield when he was 25 and thought he'd live forever. Now, at 52 with a knee that clicked when he walked, he wasn't sure why he'd come back, only that this was the last place where he still remembered how to breathe. His amber eyes scanned the valley as though it were another mission, another uncertain perimeter. The dog didn't bark much, neither did the man. Ethan parked near a weathered wooden sign half buried in Frost Silver Pine Claim. Population 24. The letters were faded, carved by men long dead. He stepped out, boots crunching on thin snow. The air bit through his jacket. He paused, looked up at the sky that felt too wide, too indifferent. Axel jumped down, sniffed the ground tail low, alert but calm. Ethan crouched beside him, scratching the rough fur behind his ears. "Well, partner," he murmured, "guess it's just us again." His voice was gravel and regret. A few locals watched from the porches of unfinished cabins, new settlers, younger men. They saw a stranger with an old dog and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. Someone called out, "You looking to buy land?" Mr. Ethan nodded once. "Just need a quiet place to ride out the winter." The man laughed. "Not much quiet up here when the wind starts screaming." "You got a proper cabin?" "Not yet," Ethan said. "Then you'll freeze before Christmas." The others chuckled, the sound swallowed by the valley. Ethan didn't answer. He was used to that tone, the polite disbelief of men who hadn't yet learned humility from nature. He led Axel toward a slope that overlooked a frozen creek where the spruce trees grew thick and the soil looked dry. The place felt right. He stood there a long time, hands deep in his jacket pockets, staring at the ridges. He could almost hear the voices of his unit echoing through memory. "Ward, check the wind direction. Watch your line of retreat." He remembered Reese, his closest friend, how the IED had gone off before dawn, how the desert sand had turned red. For years afterward, Ethan couldn't stand the sound of silence. It reminded him of the seconds before an explosion. The VA doctors called it trauma. He called it penance. Axel nudged his knee, bringing him back to the cold present. "Yeah," Ethan muttered. "We'll stay here?" That night, he slept in his truck with Axel curled beside him, both wrapped in an old army blanket that still smelled faintly of diesel and smoke. The valley was silent except for the creak of trees shifting under frost. Ethan stared through the cracked windshield at the faint outline of the spruce. Something about that tree reminded him of a promise one he never made, but somehow still owed. He dreamed of fire and sand, of a boy's face covered in dust, and woke before dawn, heart-hammering. Axel's nose pressed against his hand, steady and grounding. "I'm fine," Ethan whispered. "Just ghosts." In the pale morning light, he brewed coffee over a small camp stove and watched the steam curl away into the cold. He took a sip and winced at the bitterness. "You think they're right?" he asked. "Axel, think we'll freeze?" The dog tilted his head, then rested it on Ethan's thigh. He took that as an answer. He looked at the valley again, frozen ground. Old scars of mining cuts, cabins half built by men who thought they could tame this place. The mountains didn't care. They never had. But for the first time in years, Ethan felt something almost like purpose. It wasn't peace, not yet. But it was a beginning. He reached into the glove compartment, pulled out a small metal tag, the last thing he'd kept from Reese's uniform, and rubbed it between his fingers. "You always said I couldn't stay still," he murmured. "Guess you were wrong." He slid the tag back into his pocket, patted Axel's side, and looked at the spruce tree again. "We'll make it work," he said quietly. "One more winter." By the third morning, the thin frost on the truck's windshield had turned into a hard sheet of ice. Ethan broke it with the back of his knife and watched the shards scatter like glass. The settlement below the ridge had come alive. Axes clanged, hammers rang, and smoke curled from a dozen makeshift chimneys. Men in thick wool coats shouted to each other across the snow, stacking pine logs into neat walls. Their breath hung in the air like smoke from small fires. Ethan watched for a while before deciding to walk down. Axel followed close behind his paws, crunching softly on the snow. The dog's head was high ears, flicking with each sound. The men stopped long enough to look at the stranger. They had seen him drive in a few days before alone, and then disappear into the hills. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a red beard and a square jaw, straightened from his sawing. "Morning," he said, wiping his hands on his coat. "You're the vet up by the creek." Ethan nodded. "Name's Ward. Just getting settled?" The man nodded back. "Maury Halden," he said. "Been building cabins here since my daddy's time. You got yourself a place already." Ethan hesitated, glancing toward the tree line. "Not yet, still figuring it out." Maury grinned, but there was no warmth in it. "Figuring it out, huh? Winter's 3 weeks away. Around here, figuring gets a man frozen." The other workers chuckled quietly. Ethan didn't smile. "I'll manage." He pointed at the lumber stacked near the tool shed. "Mind if I trade for a few planks and some wire?" Maury tilted his head, studying him. "Sure," he said slowly. "What are you building, soldier? A coop for that dog?" More laughter followed. Ethan waited for it to fade. "Shelter," he said simply. Maury leaned on his axe. "You're a soldier, not a trapper. A hole won't keep you warm here. It'll keep you buried." The words hung in the cold like frost. Axel stood still beside Ethan, Hackle's barely raised eyes golden and steady. Ethan met Maury's stare, his expression unreadable. "I've been buried before," he said quietly. "I know how to dig my way out." For a moment no one spoke. The wind hissed through the pines, brushing snow off their limbs. Maury looked away, first muttering something about stubborn old men. Ethan picked up a coil of rusted wire and a few scrapboards, left 2 folded bills on the workbench, and turned back toward the ridge. "Suit yourself," Maury called after him. "But when that blizzard hits, don't come knocking." Ethan didn't answer. He walked uphill, breath-steady boots sinking deep into the snow. Axel padded beside him, occasionally glancing up as if to read the man's mood. When they reached the edge of the forest, Ethan stopped to rest. From there, he could see the entire camp, the smoke rising, the cabins, half-finished, the men working against time. He understood their fear. He just didn't share it. Axel pressed against his leg-tail still. "They're good people," Ethan murmured. "They just forgot how to listen." He ran a hand through the dog's fur. The wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of resin and distant wood smoke. A cloud drifted across the sun, dimming the valley in muted gray. It was the kind of silence Ethan liked, the kind that didn't demand anything. He took out his notebook, its leather cover scarred and faded from years of sand and sweat, and began to sketch the outline of the spruce tree he'd chosen. He drew measurements in the margins, rough angles, ideas for support beams, airflow and drainage. His handwriting was slow, careful, like someone rebuilding thought by thought. Axel lay down beside him, chin on his paws, watching. "We'll start tomorrow," Ethan said, "before the ground freezes." He looked again toward the cabins below bright roofs, proud and square. They'd stand tall for a while, he thought, until the cold found their seams. He wasn't angry at them for doubting him. People always doubted what they didn't understand. He folded the notebook shut, slid it into his coat, and looked out at the spreading shadows across the snow. The sun was already dropping behind the ridge, washing everything in pale gold. Axel yawned softly, the sound small against the vastness of the valley. Ethan knelt, brushing snow from the dog's fur. "You know," he said quietly, "they're not wrong about one thing. This place can bury a man. But maybe that's the point." The wind rose again, carrying the scent of snow from the north. Ethan stood eyes following the tree line until they met the old spruce waiting in the distance. Its roots twisted from the ground like the fingers of something ancient and patient. He exhaled slowly, a thin ribbon of steam fading into the cold. "Come on, boy," he said, voice steady but soft. "Let's go see if the earth still remembers how to keep us." Axel gave one low bark, and together they disappeared into the trees, the sound of hammers and human laughter fading behind them like a song from another life. The next morning came gray and silent, the kind of cold that bit at the back of the throat and turned every breath into mist. Ethan left camp before sunrise, carrying the wire, a small axe, and his shovel across his shoulder. Axel trotted beside him, tail low but steady eyes fixed ahead. The valley still slept below its thin plumes of chimney smoke rising straight into the frozen air. Ethan's boots sank into snow crust with a muffled crunch. When they reached the clearing, he stopped at the base of the old spruce. The tree was enormous, its trunk wider than the door of a truck, its bark weathered into deep furrows like wrinkles on an old soldier's face. The roots spread outward and downward, gripping the frozen ground like the fingers of something ancient and knowing. Ethan removed his gloves, touched the bark with a bare hand, and closed his eyes. "You've been standing here longer than any of us," he murmured. "Guess you know a thing or two about surviving winters." Axel tilted his head as though listening too. The man took a step back, studied the slope the way the wind cut through the valley, the shadows cast by the branches. He knelt, brushed away snow, and began to dig. The first sound of steel against frozen soil echoed through the woods, sharp, rhythmic, determined. Each thrust of the shovel was deliberate. He marked the perimeter, roughly 8 feet long, 6 wide. The frost gave way to dark earth, damp but not wet. It was good soil insulated by the needles that had fallen for centuries. Axel lay down nearby, watching his every move. From the ridge above, faint laughter drifted down. Ethan glanced up to see 2 men from the camp, Maury among them, leaning on a half-built roof. "Dog's digging your coffin," Ward 1 called out. "Hope he knows how to say goodbye." Their voices carried easily in the thin air. Ethan didn't look up again. He just kept digging the shovel, biting into the ground, each motion a reply that needed no words. The rhythm steadied his breathing. The smell of earth filled the air, rich, alive, and somehow comforting. He'd forgotten that smell. Axel stood circled once and began pawing at the edge of the pit, tossing dirt aside with powerful kicks. "Good boy," Ethan said softly. "Guess you want your share of the work." For a while, they worked together in silence, man and dog, the sound of their digging merging with the wind in the pines. The pit grew deeper, wide enough for both of them to stand in it without the wind biting their faces. Ethan paused, leaned on his shovel, and wiped sweat from his forehead, even as frost clung to his beard. He remembered a night years ago somewhere near the Badlands, when a Lakota scout had sat beside him by the fire and told him a story about the earth. "The earth doesn't kill the man who listens," the scout had said, voice low, eyes reflecting firelight. "It keeps him." At the time, Ethan had nodded out of politeness. Now, in the middle of a frozen Montana hillside, those words felt heavier, truer. He glanced around, marking the slope again, imagining where runoff would go once the thaw came. He wasn't building a hole. He was building trust between himself and the ground. Axel jumped into the pit beside him, landing softly. His paws pressed into the cool earth. The dog sniffed around, then began scraping again, choosing a spot Ethan hadn't considered. When the soil came up dry, Ethan smiled faintly. "You've got a better nose for this than me," he said. "We'll start the sleeping side here." The day stretched slow and pale. Occasionally, he heard hammers echoing from the camp below, followed by bursts of laughter. The contrast was strange, men working together under the sun and one man digging into the shadows. By noon, the pit was waist-deep. Ethan lined the bottom with pine needles, dry and thick, then laid down a tarp he'd brought from the truck. He touched the walls, feeling the cool firmness of the soil. The wind couldn't reach this far now. It was already warmer down there, just a few degrees, but enough to notice. He looked up at the sky, a narrow slice of pale blue framed by roots and branches. Axel climbed out, then turned back and barked once, sharp and urgent. Ethan followed his gaze. Maury and the other men were still watching from a distance, their figures small against the snow. They shouted something he couldn't quite hear. Maybe another joke, maybe a warning. He didn't care which. He climbed out of the pit, knelt beside Axel, and poured water into a small tin bowl for him. The dog drank tongue-lapping softly, steam rising from his breath. Ethan took a sip from his canteen and sat back against the tree trunk. The cold crept into his bones again, but his heart felt steady. He looked at the growing hole in the earth and imagined it finished a place of quiet warmth, hidden from the wind, strong as the roots that sheltered it. "This will work," he whispered. Axel lifted his head ears, twitching as if agreeing. Above them, a raven cawed, once its cry echoing through the hollow like a challenge. Ethan stood again, gripped the shovel, and drove it into the soil with renewed strength. "Let them laugh," he said under his breath. "We'll see who freezes first." The shovel struck deeper this time, sending up a faint scent of loam and resin. Axel returned to digging paws, moving fast, his body trembling not from cold but from energy purpose. Together they carved into the earth a rhythm that belonged to survival itself, the valley watching in silent judgment the first snowflakes of winter, already starting to fall through the branches above. By the time the sun rose again, the valley had turned white. A soft layer of snow blanketed everything, muting sound, softening the edges of the world. Ethan stood at the rim of the half-finished pit, steam rising from his breath shovel in hand. Axel paced beside him, nose dusted with frost. The hole was deeper now, 8 feet long, 6 feet wide, 4.5 feet deep, sloping gently toward the massive spruce trunk, so that meltwater would drain away rather than pool inside. The roots of the old tree curved through the soil like ribs, giving the walls a kind of strength no timber could match. Ethan brushed his glove along one, feeling how dry and solid it was even after centuries underground. It would hold. He'd measured everything twice, testing the ground for softness, checking for frost pockets. Each step was deliberate, as if he were building more than shelter. Something sacred, something that might outlast the winter. Axel watched him with that same calm focus he once had on patrols overseas. When Ethan pointed toward a fallen limb, Axel trotted off through the snow and dragged it back between his teeth. "Good boy," Ethan murmured. The dog's eyes caught the pale morning light, intelligent and loyal. Together, they began to gather the supports. 4 straight lodgepole pines, each stripped of bark, and roughly the width of a man's thigh. Ethan hauled them across the snow sweat, freezing in the creases of his neck. He set them across the pit's width, spacing them evenly. When he stepped back, the framework already resembled the skeleton of a roof. He tested the weight by leaning on one of the beams. It didn't budge. "That's what we need," he said to Axel. "Strong, simple, quiet." Axel wagged his tail once, then disappeared into the woods again to fetch smaller branches. Ethan began layering them perpendicular to the beams, choosing only the straightest saplings, cutting off knots that could create air pockets. The work was slow measured. He counted 47 saplings before he stopped, shoulders aching, hands stiff. Each one he placed carefully, like a craftsman setting the ribs of a ship. Snow fell lightly, dusting the structure with white, and filling the air with the scent of sap and earth. By midday, the sky had dimmed to pewter. He started the thatching, weaving green spruce boughs across the lattice. The needles pointed downward, overlapping like feathers, a trick he'd learned years ago from a Lakota builder who'd said that the direction of the needles decided whether you stayed dry or drowned. The rhythmic motion of his hands calmed him. The forest was silent except for the whisper of falling snow and Axel's steady breathing. After the boughs came bark. Ethan scouted dead trees nearby, testing each with his axe until he found those whose bark separated cleanly from the trunk. He pried off long panels 3 feet by 2, rough but intact, and carried them back to the pit. Axel followed close, tugging smaller pieces behind him, tail swaying like a metronome. The dog seemed to sense the urgency of the work. Ethan laid the bark panels in overlapping rows, shingle style, each layer slightly offset to shed water downslope. The pattern was tedious but crucial. One mistake here, one loose seam, and the melt could undo everything. His breath came short from the effort. Occasionally he paused to rest his back against the spruce trunk, gloved hands trembling from fatigue. The tree loomed above him, patient and immovable. Its massive trunk blocked the worst of the wind, creating a pocket of stillness around the pit. When Ethan finally looked up, he saw movement on the ridge, two figures watching. One of them, a tall man in a wool coat, lifted an arm in greeting. Sanderson, one of the younger miners, had wandered up to see what madness the old soldier was up to. He called down his voice, carrying easily through the crisp air. Even badgers know better. The other man beside him laughed, the sound echoing off the frozen hillside. Ethan straightened, met their gaze briefly, then returned to his work. "Badgers live longer than miners out here," he said, loud enough for them to hear. The laughter faded. Sanderson shook his head, muttering something Ethan couldn't catch, and the two turned away. Ethan exhaled slowly. He wasn't angry. Pity maybe men so certain that the way things had always been done was the only way they could be. He ran his hand along the edge of the bark roof. The layers were solid now, thick as a wall. He pressed down, no movement. Snow would only add insulation once it fell heavier. Axel stood at the entrance watching him. His ears twitched at every sound, his breath fogging the air. "Almost there, partner," Ethan said. He grabbed handfuls of dry moss and packed them along the seams, sealing any gaps between the bark pieces. When he finished, he stepped back to study the structure. The spruce's massive trunk formed one wall. The pit itself was narrow, but deep enough to stand in without crouching. Above, the layered roof blended into the forest floor so seamlessly that from a distance it looked like nothing more than a patch of disturbed ground. He tested the airflow by lighting a small scrap of paper near the opening. The smoke curled gently upward, then drifted away, not trapped, not too fast. "Perfect." Axel nosed his leg, whining softly. "Yeah," Ethan said. "We'll rest soon." He brushed snow from the entrance ramp, smoothing it down so it sloped naturally. The daylight was fading, leaving the world washed in shades of blue and gray. He gathered a few more boughs for insulation, dragging them to the side of the shelter, while Axel trotted back and forth, gathering what he could find. Together, they worked until the forest grew quiet again, until the first stars began to pierce the clouds above the valley, until all that remained was the smell of pine, the rhythm of breathing, and the slow settling of snow over a roof that no one else believed could save them. By late November, the sky over Silver Pine Valley had turned the color of steel. Birds vanished. The forest grew silent as if holding its breath. Ethan woke before dawn on the 17th to a sound he hadn't heard in years, the low, endless roar of wind tearing through the mountains. The thermometer nailed to the spruce read -40. He stood for a moment, staring at it, breath clouding around his face. "Here it comes," he whispered. Axel pressed against his leg, tail, stiff head tilted toward the gusts sweeping through the trees. Snow came first as a whisper, then as a sheet of white that erased the horizon. Within an hour, the valley disappeared beneath it. Ethan worked fast, hauling the last of his supplies into the shelter: firewood rations, a tin kettle, a box of matches. The air burned his throat, the kind of cold that stole strength from a man before he realized it. Axel trotted back and forth, carrying small bundles of kindling in his jaws, his fur already rimed with frost. Inside, Ethan commanded softly, and the dog obeyed, slipping through the narrow entrance tunnel. Ethan followed, pulling the wooden hatch shut behind them. The sound of the wind dulled immediately. It was like stepping into another world. The dim glow of daylight filtered through cracks in the roof bark, casting faint stripes across the earthen walls. He set the hatch beam across the entrance, sealing it tight. The temperature inside was still tolerable, 43, maybe 45 degrees. He crouched beside the small fire pit he'd lined with creek stones and struck a match. The first spark caught the flame flickering low. He added slivers of bark, dry pine needles, a handful of shavings. The smoke rose slowly through the narrow vent he'd built the current, drawing it out just as he'd planned. Within minutes, the air warmed. Axel curled near the fire, his sides rising and falling in calm rhythm, the light glinting off his coat. Ethan unrolled his sleeping pad, set the kettle on a flat stone near the flame, and poured water. The hiss of heat against metal filled the silence. Outside, the storm roared like a living thing. He could feel it through the ground, a deep vibration, steady as the ocean. The wind clawed at the forest, testing everything built by human hands. He pictured the cabins down the valley, the men patching cracks with cloth, feeding fires that could never keep up. He knew that sound, the creak of timber surrendering under pressure, the thin whistle of air through new seams. He'd heard it before in a different kind of storm, a sandstorm that had buried vehicles in Afghanistan. Nature always won the first round. Ethan leaned back against the wall, the packed soil cool but dry. He pulled the thermometer from his pocket and watched it settle at 49 degrees. He smiled faintly. "Told you, boy," he said, voice low but certain. "We don't fight the cold, we work with it." Axel shifted, resting his muzzle on Ethan's boot. The dog's eyes half closed, unbothered by the gale outside. Ethan reached down, scratching behind his ear. "Good soldier," he murmured. The fire cracked softly. For the first time since the storm began, he felt something like peace. Every detail of the shelter worked as intended. The slope drained meltwater, the roof held firm under the weight of accumulating snow, and the tunnel entrance, angled southeast, blocked the brunt of the wind. The warmth stayed trapped, circulating slowly around the confined space. It wasn't comfort, not in the soft sense, but it was safety, and that was enough. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the bitter smell cutting through the damp air. Axel raised his head, briefly, nose twitching. "None for you," Ethan said. "You're hyper enough." The dog thumped his tail once against the ground, then went still again. Outside, the wind reached a new pitch, a hollow wail that echoed through the tunnel like a warning. Snow pressed against the hatch with the dull thuds. The firelight flickered shadows sliding across the earthen walls like ghosts. Ethan stared at them for a long moment. He thought of the men in their cabins, of Maury and Sanderson, of their laughter on the ridge just days ago. He hoped they'd built their roofs thick. He hoped they'd remember to leave air vents open, but hope was thin in this kind of weather. He fed another piece of wood into the fire, careful to conserve his supply. Every log had to last. Axel stirred ears, pricking a soft growl rumbling in his chest. Ethan listened. Beneath the storm's fury, another sound pulsed, a deep, rhythmic cracking somewhere in the distance. He recognized it instantly. "Trees," he muttered. The cold was snapping them clean. He reached for his rifle more from habit than need and set it beside the wall. "It's fine, boy," he said, though his voice had lost some steadiness. "They're just breaking under the ice." But Axel didn't relax. He stood tail stiff, facing the entrance. A gust slammed against the hatch, making it shudder. Snow filtered through the seams in tiny puffs. Ethan moved closer, pressed his hand to the wooden plank. It held firm. "Not today," he whispered, as if speaking to the storm itself. He could feel the weight of the cold pressing down, relentless, ancient. He stepped back, tending to the fire again, feeding it slowly. The orange glow deepened, painting the walls with warmth. Axel finally lay down once more, his head resting on his paws, his body a steady comfort in the half-light. Ethan exhaled, slow and even, listening to the world rage above them. The storm did not rest. By the third night, the wind had grown meaner, shrieking through the valley with the voice of something alive. Snow had buried the cabins down below. Only the tips of their roofs showed through the drifts like the backs of drowning beasts. Inside the shelter, Ethan dozed lightly, half sitting, one hand resting on Axel's back. The fire had burned down to coals, a dull red glow breathing warmth into the small earthen chamber. Axel's ears twitched suddenly. The dog lifted his head, alert, then growled a low sound, uncertain but insistent. Ethan opened his eyes. For a moment he heard nothing beyond the storm's howl. Then faintly, through the rush of wind, came a human sound, a voice thin, torn apart by distance. A cry. He froze, listening again. It came once more, weaker this time. Ethan grabbed his coat and gloves. "Stay," he said, but Axel ignored the command, already pushing toward the hatch, muscles coiled. Ethan sighed and followed. The moment he cracked open the wooden hatch, the wind hit like a wall. Snow whipped into his face, stinging like sand. The world outside was a blur of white chaos, sky and ground indistinguishable. He pulled his scarf higher, shielding his mouth, and climbed out. Axel bounded ahead, his black and tan form cutting through the storm like a moving shadow. Ethan shouted, but his voice vanished into the roar. He followed the dog's tracks, half blind, his legs sinking to the knees with each step. The wind burned his lungs. He could barely see only shapes, the outlines of buried cabins, fallen trees, drifts as high as the roofs. Then he saw it, a dark form sprawled near the ruins of one of the cabins. Axel stood over it, barking into the storm. Ethan stumbled closer and knelt. It was Maury Halden. The man's face was gray-blue, his beard rimed with ice. His eyes fluttered open at the touch. "Ward," he whispered hoarsely. "Fire went out." His voice cracked. Ethan checked his pulse, faint, but still there. "You'll be all right," he said, though he wasn't sure. "Come on." Axel pressed against Maury's side, the dog's warmth steady and alive. Ethan lifted Maury under the arms, dragging him through the snow towards the shelter. The distance, which had seemed short in daylight, now felt endless. The storm fought them every step. At one point, Ethan nearly lost balance as the wind shoved him sideways, but Axel barked, circling back, keeping close to Maury's legs like a guide. Finally, they reached the spruce. Ethan cleared the drift from the entrance, shoved the hatch open and half fell inside, pulling Maury down after him. The sudden quiet inside the earthen walls was jarring. He shut the hatch, dropped the wooden beam across it, and turned to see Axel shaking snow from his coat, spraying droplets that hissed as they hit the coals. Maury collapsed beside the fire, gasping. His hands were white fingers stiff. Ethan moved fast, stripping off the man's outer coat and boots, rubbing his arms and legs to restore circulation. "Stay awake," he ordered, voice firm. Maury's lips barely moved. "Thought we built it right," he murmured. "Thick walls, big fire." Ethan poured water into a cup, heated it quickly, then held it to the man's mouth. Maury drank in slow sips, eyes darting to the earthen walls around him. "This place," he rasped. "It's warm." 49 degrees, Ethan said, give or take. Maury gave a weak laugh that turned into a cough. You're right," he managed. "This isn't a grave." Ethan looked at him, then at Axel, who had curled close against Maury's back, the dog's body heat already working its quiet magic. "No," Ethan said softly. "It's a second chance." The wind howled louder above, pressing against the roof, but the shelter did not move. The bark and earth absorbed the force, turning violence into a distant murmur. Maury's breathing steadied little by little. Ethan sat back, exhaustion washing over him. He hadn't realized how cold he'd become until the warmth began to return to his fingers. He looked at the fire, at the small space that had once felt barely enough for one man and his dog, now holding 3 lives. "You burned through all your wood," Ethan said quietly. Maury nodded weakly. "It wasn't enough." Walls cracked, air came in, couldn't stop it. His voice trailed off. "The fire died fast. It always does," Ethan said, "when it has to fight the wind." He fed another piece of wood into the flames, watching them flare brighter, painting the walls in shades of gold and amber. Maury turned toward Axel, eyes glassy with gratitude. "Smart dog," he whispered. Axel only blinked, then rested his head on Maury's chest. Ethan smiled faintly. "He's got instincts," he said, "knows when someone needs warmth more than him." Outside, the storm raged without mercy, but inside, the air was calm. The smell of smoke and damp bark filled the space, earthy and comforting. Maury's eyes began to close. Ethan let him rest, but stayed alert, listening to the muted roar above. He thought of the other men still out there in their cabins of splintering pine, fighting against something they could never outbuild. Axel shifted again, pressing closer to the wounded man. The firelight caught in the dog's eyes, turning them amber bright. Ethan leaned his head back against the packed wall, fatigue heavy in his limbs. He could still feel the wind outside, hear the weight of snow piling above them, but the shelter held. For now, the storm did not pass quickly. What began as a single day of wind stretched into 6 long nights where time lost all measure. Snow fell until the world outside vanished beneath 6 feet of white silence. Inside the earth, Ethan's shelter became the only pulse of warmth left in Silver Pine Valley. The temperature inside held steady around 45 degrees, sometimes 48 when the fire burned strong. Outside, the air was still at 40 below. The contrast felt unreal. Ethan marked the passing days with scratches on the wooden beam near the entrance. Maury slept most of the time, his color returning slowly. The first 2 days, Ethan barely spoke. He focused on keeping the fire alive, rationing food, melting snow for water. Axel stayed close, lying beside Maury, occasionally lifting his head at distant noises, the groan of trees breaking the faint crack of ice splitting under pressure. On the third night, just before dawn, Axel's ears shot up again. He began barking toward the tunnel, sharp and urgent. Ethan moved to quiet him, but then he heard it a knock, faint and irregular. Someone outside. He hurried to lift the hatch, bracing himself against the sudden blast of air. 3 figures stumbled in, snow-covered and shaking from exhaustion. Their eyes were wide skin, pale faces barely human in the dim light. One of them collapsed the moment the hatch shut behind them. Ethan caught him under the arms, dragged him closer to the fire. "You're all right," he said, his voice calm but firm. The second man, Sanderson, the younger miner who had mocked him weeks ago, stared around the small chamber in disbelief. "How?" he stammered. "How's it warm in here?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He poured warm water into tin cups, handed them out. Axel moved among the newcomers, sniffing each his tail low but steady. Maury stirred weakly, opening his eyes. When he saw Sanderson, his lips curved into a faint smile. "Guess you came to the fool's grave too," he murmured. Sanderson lowered his head. "Cabin's gone," he said quietly. "Roof caved in. Couldn't keep the fire lit more than an hour." Webb and Carter froze, trying to dig out the woodpile. His voice trembled not from cold, but memory. Ethan handed him a blanket. "Sit," he said simply. The shelter, already small, felt impossibly tight now. 6 by 8 feet 5 men and 1 dog pressed together beneath the earth. Yet the air remained bearable. The warmth seemed to breathe from the soil itself as if the earth had taken pity on them. Ethan adjusted the vent to keep the smoke thin and steady. When he checked the thermometer, it still read 48 degrees. "We'll be fine," he said mostly to reassure the others. "Stay dry. Keep close. It's not much space, but it's safe." Axel wedged himself between 2 of the new arrivals, resting his head on one man's boot. The miner flinched at first, then relaxed, fingers sinking into the thick fur. "He's warm," the man whispered, eyes closing. For hours they sat in silence, the only sound the soft crackle of fire and the distant wail of wind. The shelter smelled of smoke pine and damp wool. No one complained. No one dared. Each of them understood in some quiet way that this hole in the ground had become their only proof of life. Later, as the storm raged above, Sanderson spoke, his voice a rasp in the half-dark. "How the hell did you know?" The others turned to look at Ethan. His face was half-shadowed by firelight. The lines deeper, the eyes calm. He hesitated before answering, then reached down, resting his hand gently on Axel's head. "I didn't," he said. But he did. The dog lifted his eyes briefly, as if understanding. The men stared, none speaking. Maury let out a weak laugh that turned into a cough. "Guess you should have asked him before building," he said. Even Sanderson managed a faint smile. The air eased for a moment. Ethan checked their supplies, 2 cans of beans, a handful of jerky enough wood for maybe 4 more days if rationed carefully. Each of the newcomers had managed to bring in a small armload of dry wood from their collapsed cabins, which would stretch the fire for another 2 days at a low burn. "We'll stretch it," he said almost to himself. "It's not the first time I've had to make do." He added a single log to the fire. The flames licked upward, sending thin shadows dancing across the earthen walls. The men watched in silence. Time blurred again, marked only by shifts of light and the changing tone of the wind. Occasionally, one of them would speak quiet confessions about families back home, letters, unsent debts, unpaid. Ethan listened without judgment. He understood the need to fill silence before it swallowed you whole. Axel moved between them like a sentinel offering comfort in his stillness. The wind never stopped. It screamed above like a ghost, searching for what it had lost. But down below, the small room pulsed with life, steady and defiant. 5 men and 1 dog bound together by necessity and grace. When the wind finally stopped, it was so sudden that silence itself felt like a sound. Ethan woke, first unsure if the absence of howling meant mercy or another kind of trick. He sat up slowly, blinking in the dim glow of the dying fire. The air inside the shelter was still warm steady at 48 degrees. Axel stirred beside him, ears twitching. For the first time in 6 days, the ground didn't tremble. Ethan rose, grabbed his gloves, and reached for the wooden hatch. The plank was half buried under packed snow, but it moved easily under his push-the-design, working as he'd intended. A burst of cold air slid in sharp but clean, carrying a faint brightness with it. He squinted up, blinking against the white. The sky above was blue again, pale, endless, beautiful. He exhaled, smiling for the first time in days. "Sunrise," he murmured. Axel pushed past him, bounding into the snow like a creature reborn. The dog barked, once the sound echoing across the quiet valley. Ethan climbed out after him, boots sinking into drifts that reached nearly to his knees. The storm had buried everything. The cabins that once stood proud along the creek were shattered roofs, caved walls split. Smoke rose from only 1 or 2 chimneys, weak and uncertain. Most of the camp lay still. The world looked as if it had been swept clean, all color replaced by white and silver. But the tree pit shelter, his shelter, stood untouched. The bark roof held firm under the weight of snow. Not a single seam had split. Ethan brushed frost from the entrance, straightened, and took in the scene. The old spruce stood tall above him, its branches heavy but unbroken. He placed a hand against its trunk, feeling the solid warmth of life under the bark. "Told you, Axel," he said quietly, voice carrying in the still air. "Never doubt an old dog's instincts." Axel wagged his tail and pressed against his leg. Behind them, movement stirred. The other men emerged one by one, blinking against the sudden light, faces pale from days underground but eyes wide with awe. Sanderson squinted at the sky, tears freezing at the corners of his eyes. "It's over," he said, disbelief thick in his voice. Ethan nodded. For now. They stood in silence for a long time, the cold sun washing over their faces. Maury was the last to climb out, leaning heavily on a stick. He looked around at the wreckage of the camp, the twisted beams, the collapsed walls, and shook his head slowly. "Never seen cold tearwood apart like that," he muttered. "But this—" He turned toward the spruce and the small mound that had kept them alive. "This thing didn't even flinch." Ethan shrugged. "It's not a thing. It's just the ground knowing what it's doing." The others didn't speak, but their faces said everything. For the rest of the morning, they walked the valley, checking what little remained. They found 2 cabins still standing, but gutted by frost. Every other structure had failed, cracked seams, collapsed roofs, chimneys broken in half. In one place, the snow had buried an entire home to the roofline. The silence felt heavy, sacred, almost as if the mountain itself was mourning. By noon, the survivors gathered around Ethan's shelter. Sanderson kicked lightly at the snow near the entrance. "Guess we start over," he said. "Can you show us how?" Ethan hesitated, glancing at Axel, who was lying by the spruce roots watching the men with calm, golden eyes. "It's not complicated," Ethan said at last. 8 feet long, 6 wide, 4 deep. You find a strong tree with roots that keep the soil dry. The earth does most of the work." Maury gave a tired smile. "You heard the man," he said to the others. "Let's get digging." The few crews who had ridden out the storm in half-buried cabins or dug themselves free at first light began to gather around Ethan's shelter when they saw it still standing. Within an hour, the sound of shovels replaced the silence that had hung over the valley. Men began carving into the earth, marking outlines around trees, testing soil, talking quietly among themselves. The rhythm returned different, now humbler, grateful. Ethan stood aside watching them work. Sunlight filtered through the trees, melting a thin crust of ice on the spruce needles. For the first time since the storm began, the air smelled faintly of pine again, alive and clean. One of the miners called out, "What do we call these anyway, tree shelters?" "Root houses," Maury grinned, looking back at Ethan. "Ward's burrows," he said. The name spread quickly, a kind of inside joke turned into respect. Ethan shook his head, chuckling under his breath. "It was the dog's idea," he said. "I just had the shovel." The men laughed softly, and for a moment the valley felt human again. Axel barked once, as if agreeing, then trotted off toward the edge of the forest, nose to the ground, tail high. Ethan followed with his eyes, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the sun. Around them, the survivors kept digging their movements slower but surer now, guided not by pride but by memory. Above the valley, the spruce trees swayed gently in the returning breeze, whispering secrets of endurance that only the listening could hear. By late March, the valley began to breathe again. The walls of snow shrank day by day, trickling into rivulets that carved new paths through the frozen ground. The air smelled different. Wet pine thawed soil, something like forgiveness. Ethan woke one morning to the sound of running water. It wasn't loud, but it filled the silence like a song he hadn't realized he missed. He stepped outside with Axel trotting beside him, paws sinking into the slush. The spruce that had guarded them all winter now dripped steadily, each drop glinting in the pale sun. Beyond the ridge, the creek had broken through its icy prison, curling around the wreckage of the old cabins. Wooden beams lay scattered like bones. Yet here, near the tree, life had begun again. Green shoots pressed through the melting snow, small but defiant. Ethan crouched to touch one, smiling faintly. "You made it," he whispered. Axel wagged his tail and nudged his shoulder. "Yeah, we did too," Ethan added. He turned back to the shelter. Its roof, once buried in white, now showed patches of bark and moss. It looked like it had grown straight from the earth itself. He spent the morning cleaning the entrance, sweeping away mud, checking the drainage. Everything had held perfectly, no leaks, no rot, just the quiet proof of good work. He found an old plank washed down from the ruins of a cabin and carried it to the tree. Using his knife, he carved slowly, carefully, the letters forming under his steady hand. When he was done, he set the plank upright beside the entrance, pressing it deep into the thawing ground. The words caught the sunlight. He didn't dig a grave. He dug a home. Ethan stood back and stared at it for a long time, the simple truth of it sinking into him like warmth after cold. By afternoon, the sound of voices reached him. Down the slope, men were at work, shovels biting into wet earth, laughter echoing faintly. Where once there had been scorn, now there was something like reverence. Dozens of small shelters dotted the tree line, each one following the same principles, low profile, rooted near strong trunks angled to the southeast. Some used pine, others cedar. The valley had turned into a living blueprint of survival. Sanderson waved from a distance, his face sunburned, his voice cheerful. "Yours still the best one, Ward," he called. Ethan smiled. Only because Axel supervised, he shouted back. The dog barked once, as if confirming it. Later, as the sun sank behind the mountains, Maury approached, leaning on a new walking stick. He moved slower than before, but stood straighter. The frostbite had cost him 2 toes, but his spirit had returned stronger than ever. He stopped beside the sign and read it quietly, lips moving over the words. "That's the truth," he said finally. "You saved us, soldier." Ethan shook his head. "No," he replied softly. "I just listened to the land and to him." Axel looked up at the sound of his voice tail brushing against the mud. Maury followed his gaze and smiled. "Smart dog," he said, "smarter than the rest of us put together." Ethan chuckled, maybe just more patient. They stood there for a while in companionable silence. The air was still cold enough to sting, but full of promise. The kind of cold that made you believe in another summer. In the days that followed, life began to knit itself back together. The miners repaired what they could, scavenged what the storm hadn't taken, and built differently this time, closer to the trees, closer to the ground. Some added stone walls for strength. Others dug deeper, experimenting with airflow and insulation, just as Ethan had. The valley became a workshop of quiet innovation. They called their designs Ward's Burrows, though Ethan never used the name himself. To him, it was all just listening to what worked, to what endured. The new shelters were humble but warm, the kind of structures that didn't challenge the mountain but respected it. One evening, as the first rain of spring fell soft against the forest, Ethan sat by the entrance with Axel at his feet. The rain pattered on the bark roof above, gentle and steady. Across the valley, smoke rose from a dozen small chimneys. People laughed again. He felt the weight of it all. Lost survival change settle somewhere quiet inside him. Axel's head rested on his knee, eyes half-closed content. "Guess this place got a second chance," Ethan said. The dog thumped his tail once in reply. The light dimmed, turning the world gold and green. Ethan watched the last of the snow melt into the soil and thought of all the winters behind him and all the ones still waiting beyond the ridge. Somewhere in the stillness, the earth seemed to hum in agreement, alive, forgiving, and full of memory. 8 winters passed, and Silverpine Valley no longer looked like the place that had nearly claimed them all. The cabins were gone, replaced by sturdy timber halls and green-roofed shelters built half into the ground, half into the roots of towering spruces. They called it Silverpine Survival Station, now a training outpost for forest rangers' rescue teams and anyone who wanted to learn how to live with the land instead of against it. Where Ethan's first shelter once stood, there was a small wooden lodge with an open porch and a hand-carved sign that read simply, "Ward's Burrow." The original pit still existed beneath the lodge floor, preserved like a heartbeat under the earth. Ethan Ward, now 62, lived there still. His hair had gone mostly gray, his hands lined like old bark, but his eyes held the same steady warmth they always had. Axel, the German shepherd, who had once led him through blizzards in silence, lay at his feet near the porch rail, muzzle-silvered movements slow but mind-sharp. The dog's ears still twitched at the sound of wind through the trees. Ethan sat with his mug of coffee, each dawn wrapped in his old field jacket, watching the mist lift from the valley. Every morning began the same, Axel at his side, the smell of pine in the air, the sound of water moving through the creek that had nearly frozen him once. The land had changed, but its lessons had not. He spent his days teaching now. Dozens of young men and women came each season to learn from the old veteran and his dog. They came with notebooks and cameras expecting a survival manual. They left with something different. Ethan taught them to build fires with patience, to read the way snow drifted around trees, to find dry earth even in rain, to listen to what the wind carried instead of what fear shouted. "You don't fight nature," he would tell them, his voice gravelly but calm. "You listen. The land doesn't care if you're strong. It cares if you're paying attention." The students adored Axel. The old dog had become something of a legend at the station, a symbol of endurance and quiet courage. Even with his cloudy eyes and stiff joints, he still followed Ethan everywhere, slow but faithful. Sometimes he'd rest his head on the boot of a student working too hard, as if reminding them to breathe. On the 10th anniversary of the Great Storm, the camp gathered near the old spruce tree that had saved them all. Snow fell lightly that morning, soft and gentle, more like a memory than a threat. Ethan stood before the crowd, hands clasped behind his back. "This place used to be a graveyard of mistakes," he said. "Now it's a school. That's how the land forgives us, by letting us learn." He paused, glancing down at Axel, who sat close beside him, tail sweeping the snow in slow rhythm. After the ceremony, a young student lingered as the others drifted off to their work. He was no older than 20, curious and bright-eyed, his face red from the cold. "Sir?" he said, hesitating. "May I ask something?" Ethan nodded. "Go on." The boy shuffled his boots, glancing at Axel. "How did you survive that winter? The one they all talk about." Ethan looked out across the valley, now dotted with green roofs and steady fires. The sun broke through thin clouds, painting the snow in pale gold. He took a long breath, the air crisp and clean, and knelt beside Axel, resting a hand gently on the old dog's head. The fur was coarse, now the warmth beneath it faint but steady. "Because he refused to die," Ethan said softly, smiling as he looked into the cloudy eyes that had once seen through blizzards. "So I couldn't either." The boy didn't speak. He just nodded slowly, understanding in silence what no manual could teach. The wind shifted through the trees, gentle as a sigh. For a moment, Ethan thought he could hear the past moving through it, the echo of shovels against frozen ground. The laughter of men reborn, the steady heartbeat of the earth beneath their feet. Axel leaned into his touch, closing his eyes. "You did good, old friend," Ethan whispered. The breeze stirred again, carrying the scent of snow and spruce, and the sun warmed his face. He stayed there for a long while, hand resting on the dog's neck, listening not for words, but for the quiet hum of the living land. Patient, forgiving. Around him, the students began their work, shovels breaking new earth laughter rising between the trees, the legacy of one man and one dog, written not in stone, but in the soil itself. If you found this story worth remembering, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps us keep these true stories of courage and endurance alive. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments and let us know what part of Ethan and Axel's journey stayed with you the most.